My daughter told everyone I was dying of cancer and needed expensive surgery that didn't exist, raising over $50,000 in donations while I was perfectly healthy and had no idea about her elaborate medical fraud scheme. The day I discovered what she'd done will haunt me forever. Before we dive into this shocking story, please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. My name is Carol, and at 55 years old, I thought I had a pretty good handle on my life and my relationships with my family. I'd been married to my husband Robert for 32 years, and we'd raised 3 children together in our small town of Millbrook, a close-knit community where everyone knows everyone else's business. Or so I thought. Our middle child, Jessica, had always been the most creative and ambitious of our 3 kids. At 28, she was working as a social media coordinator for a local nonprofit and had always been passionate about helping others and organizing community events. She was the type of person who would organize coat drives in the winter, food banks during the holidays, and fundraising walks for various causes throughout the year. Jessica had moved back home about 6 months earlier after ending a long-term relationship with her boyfriend of 4 years. She claimed she needed time to figure out her next steps and wanted to save money while she looked for a better job opportunity. Robert and I were happy to have her back home, and it gave us a chance to spend more quality time with our daughter during what we assumed was a temporary transition period. Looking back now, I can see that Jessica's return home wasn't about saving money or figuring out her future. It was about positioning herself to execute the most elaborate and devastating scam I could have ever imagined. But at the time, I was just grateful to have my daughter close by and to be able to support her during what seemed like a difficult period in her life. The first sign that something was happening came on a Tuesday morning in late September when my neighbor Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door with tears in her eyes and a casserole dish in her hands. I'd known Martha Henderson for over 15 years, and I'd never seen her look so emotional and concerned. "Oh, Carol," she said, wrapping me in a tight hug before I could even invite her inside. "I'm so sorry about your diagnosis. When Jessica told us at the town council meeting last night, I could barely sleep. I wanted to bring you this tuna casserole and let you know that Jim and I are here for whatever you need during your treatment." I stood there in my doorway, completely confused and holding a casserole dish, trying to process what Martha was saying. What diagnosis? What treatment? I felt perfectly fine and hadn't been to a doctor for anything more serious than my annual physical in over 2 years. My last mammogram and blood work had all come back completely normal. "Martha, I think there might be some confusion," I said gently. "I haven't been diagnosed with anything. I feel fine, and I haven't even been to the doctor recently except for my routine checkup." Martha looked at me with a mixture of confusion and what I now recognize was pity. She seemed to think I was in denial about my condition or perhaps hadn't fully processed the severity of my diagnosis. She patted my arm sympathetically and said she understood that it must be overwhelming to receive such scary news. "Jessica explained everything to us," Martha continued. "The stage 3 diagnosis, the urgent need for surgery, the experimental treatment that isn't covered by insurance. She's been so brave, organizing the fundraising campaign and handling all the logistics while you focus on your health. That girl is an angel." My blood ran cold as Martha spoke. Stage 3 what? Surgery for what condition? What fundraising campaign? I felt like I was living in some alternate reality where I had a serious medical condition that I somehow wasn't aware of. The whole conversation felt surreal and terrifying. After Martha left, I immediately went to find Jessica, who was upstairs in her room working on her laptop. When I knocked on her door and asked to speak with her, she looked up with what seemed like genuine surprise and concern. "Mom, what's wrong? You look upset," Jessica said, closing her laptop and giving me her full attention. I explained my bizarre conversation with Martha Henderson, and asked Jessica what she knew about any medical diagnosis or fundraising campaign. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across Jessica's face, a look of panic or calculation that disappeared so quickly I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. "Oh my God, Mom," Jessica said, her eyes widening with apparent shock. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. You know how Mrs. Henderson can get confused sometimes. She's probably mixing you up with someone else from the community who's dealing with health issues." Jessica's explanation seemed plausible at first. Martha Henderson was in her 70s and had occasionally mixed up details about neighbors and community events in the past. Maybe she'd confused me with another woman in town who was actually dealing with a cancer diagnosis. But something about Jessica's reaction bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. She seemed almost too quick to provide an explanation, and her suggestion that Martha had simply confused me with someone else didn't fully explain why Martha had specifically mentioned Jessica organizing a fundraising campaign. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to how people in town were treating me. What I noticed was subtle but definitely unusual. People were speaking to me in softer, more gentle tones than normal. Several acquaintances mentioned that they were thinking of me or keeping me in their prayers without specifying why. The clerk at the grocery store, who I'd known for years, looked at me with obvious sympathy and told me to stay strong. Most confusing of all, several people mentioned making donations to help with expenses, but seemed reluctant to provide details when I asked what they meant. It was as if everyone in town knew something about my life that I didn't know myself. The truth began to emerge the following week when my sister Linda called me from 2 states away. Linda and I talked on the phone at least once a week, and she'd always been direct and straightforward in her communication style. So when she started the conversation by asking how I was holding up and whether I needed her to come stay with me during my treatment, I knew something was seriously wrong. "Linda, what treatment are you talking about?" I asked, feeling the same confusion and growing dread I'd experienced during my conversation with Martha Henderson. "Carol, you don't have to pretend with me," Linda said gently. "Jessica called me last week and explained everything about your cancer diagnosis and the surgery you need. She said you were trying to stay positive and didn't want to worry the family, but that you could really use our support right now." The room started spinning as Linda spoke. Jessica had not only told our neighbors about a fictional cancer diagnosis, but she'd also reached out to my extended family with the same lies. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding or a case of confused elderly neighbors. This was a deliberate and systematic campaign of deception. "Linda, I need you to tell me exactly what Jessica said to you," I said, my voice shaking. What Linda told me next was so shocking and elaborate that I could barely process it. According to Jessica, I had been diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer 3 months earlier. The cancer was aggressive and had already begun spreading, requiring immediate surgery followed by months of chemotherapy and radiation treatments. Jessica had told Linda that the surgery alone would cost over $100,000, and that our insurance was refusing to cover the experimental treatment protocol that offered the best chance of survival. She'd explained that the family was facing financial ruin trying to pay for my medical care, and that she was organizing fundraising efforts to help cover the costs. Most devastatingly, Jessica had told Linda that I was embarrassed about our financial situation and didn't want the extended family to know how desperately we needed help. She'd positioned herself as the devoted daughter who was handling all the logistics and communication so that I could focus on fighting for my life. Linda had immediately sent a check for $5,000 to Jessica's personal account to help with my medical expenses. She'd also reached out to other family members and organized a family fundraising effort that had already raised an additional $15,000. As Linda spoke, I felt like I was listening to someone describe a nightmare. Not only was my daughter lying about me having a terminal illness, but she was using these lies to manipulate my family members into sending her money. The betrayal was so complete and so cruel that I could barely breathe. After I hung up with Linda, I sat in my kitchen in stunned silence, trying to process the full scope of what Jessica had done. She'd created an elaborate fictional medical crisis, positioned herself as my caretaker and advocate, and was actively soliciting donations from people who loved me and wanted to help during what they believed was the worst crisis of my life. I realized I needed to understand the full extent of Jessica's deception before confronting her. If she was lying to neighbors and family members, there was no telling how far she'd taken this scheme or how many people she'd manipulated with her fictional story about my health. I spent the rest of that day making phone calls to friends and family members, gradually piecing together the scope of Jessica's fraud. What I discovered was far worse than I'd initially imagined. Jessica hadn't just told a few people about my supposed cancer diagnosis. She'd launched a comprehensive fundraising campaign that had reached dozens of people in multiple states. She'd created a GoFundMe page titled "Help Carol Fight Cancer" that included detailed information about my fictional diagnosis, treatment plan, and financial needs. The page featured a recent photo of me looking tired after a long day at work, which Jessica had captioned as showing the effects of chemotherapy treatments I'd never received. The GoFundMe description was heartbreaking and detailed, describing my supposed battle with ovarian cancer and the family's desperate financial situation. Jessica had written about my brave fight against the disease and my determination to beat the odds despite the grim prognosis. She'd included specific details about treatment costs, insurance coverage gaps, and the experimental therapy that represented my last hope for survival. The page had raised over $30,000 from more than 200 donors, including family members, friends, neighbors, coworkers, and complete strangers who'd been moved by my story. People had left comments expressing their support, sharing their own experiences with cancer, and promising to keep me in their prayers. Reading those comments was one of the most heartbreaking experiences of my life. These were genuine expressions of love, support, and concern from people who believed I was fighting for my life. They donated money they probably couldn't afford to spare because they wanted to help someone they cared about during the most difficult time of her life. But even more devastating was discovering the Facebook page Jessica had created specifically for updates about my cancer journey. She'd been posting regular updates about my fictional treatments, sharing photos of me looking tired or stressed and claiming they showed the effects of chemotherapy. She'd written detailed posts about my supposed hospital visits, treatment side effects, and emotional struggles with my diagnosis. The Facebook page had hundreds of followers, including many people I'd never met who were following my story and regularly commenting with encouragement and support. Jessica had created an entire online community of people who were emotionally invested in my fictional battle with cancer. Most sickeningly, Jessica had posted photos of herself looking exhausted and stressed, writing about the challenges of being a caregiver for a parent with cancer. She'd shared posts about the emotional toll of watching a loved one suffer, the financial stress of medical bills, and her determination to do everything possible to save my life. She'd positioned herself as the devoted daughter sacrificing everything to care for her dying mother, and the online community had responded with overwhelming support and admiration for her dedication. People were praising Jessica for her strength, her love, and her tireless efforts to save my life. The level of detail and emotional manipulation in Jessica's posts was staggering. She'd clearly researched cancer symptoms, treatment protocols, and patient experiences to make her fictional updates as believable as possible. She'd included medical terminology, specific drug names, and realistic descriptions of side effects that made her posts seem authentic to people who weren't familiar with cancer treatment. As I read through months of fake updates about my fictional illness, I realized that Jessica had been planning and executing this scheme for far longer than I'd initially thought. Some of the earliest posts dated back to shortly after she'd moved back home, suggesting that her return hadn't been about saving money or transitioning between jobs, but about setting up this elaborate fraud. The financial scope of Jessica's deception was also much larger than I'd initially realized. In addition to the GoFundMe campaign and the family fundraising efforts, she'd apparently been soliciting donations through direct messages, personal conversations, and even door-to-door visits in our neighborhood. She'd told different people different stories about our insurance situation, the specific treatments I needed, and the urgency of the financial need. Some donors thought they were contributing to surgery costs, others believed they were helping with chemotherapy expenses, and still others had been told their money would pay for experimental treatments not covered by insurance. Jessica had kept meticulous records of donations received, thank you messages sent, and follow-up communications with donors. She'd created spreadsheets tracking who had donated what amounts and when, and she'd been sending regular updates to major donors about my fictional progress and ongoing needs. The organization and premeditation involved in Jessica's scheme was terrifying. This wasn't a spontaneous lie that had gotten out of hand. It was a carefully planned and systematically executed fraud that had been months in the making. But perhaps most devastating was realizing that Jessica had been using intimate details about my life and personality to make her fictional story more believable. She'd incorporated real events, genuine photographs, and authentic aspects of my character into her false narrative about my cancer battle. She'd written about my supposed determination to beat the disease by referencing my actual work ethic and resilience in overcoming past challenges. She'd used real photos from family gatherings and work events, adding fictional captions about how I was hiding my illness to protect others from worry. Jessica had essentially weaponized her knowledge of me as her mother, using everything she knew about my personality, my relationships, and my life to create a fictional version of me that people would want to help. She'd turned my actual strengths and positive qualities into tools for manipulating others. The emotional impact of discovering this betrayal was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just the lies or the money, though both were devastating enough. It was the realization that my own daughter had been using my identity and my relationships to perpetrate fraud while watching me go about my daily life completely unaware of what she was doing. Every day for months, I'd been living my normal life, going to work, running errands, visiting with friends and neighbors, while Jessica was simultaneously creating a parallel fictional version of my life where I was dying of cancer and desperately needed financial help. The two realities had been existing side by side, with me completely oblivious to the elaborate lie that was being told about me. I also realized that Jessica's behavior at home during this period made much more sense in retrospect. She'd been unusually attentive and helpful, often asking about my daily plans and taking photos of me during family gatherings. At the time, I thought she was just being a loving daughter who wanted to spend quality time together. Now I understood that she was gathering material for her fictional cancer updates. The nights she'd stayed up late on her computer, which I'd assumed was job searching or social media browsing, had actually been spent managing her fundraising campaigns and communicating with donors. The phone calls she'd been making from her room, which I'd thought were conversations with friends, had apparently been solicitation calls to potential donors. Even more chilling was realizing that Jessica had been studying my daily routine and emotional state to time her fictional updates appropriately. When I'd had a particularly stressful day at work or looked tired during dinner, she'd apparently used those observations to post about my supposed treatment side effects or disease progression. She'd been essentially conducting surveillance on my life to make her lies more believable, turning our normal mother-daughter interactions into opportunities to gather material for her fraud. Every conversation we'd had, every photo we'd taken together, every moment of normal family life had been contaminated by her deception. The decision about how to handle this situation was incredibly complex and emotionally fraught. On one hand, Jessica had clearly committed serious crimes: fraud, theft, identity theft, and probably several other charges that could result in significant prison time. The victims of her scheme included not only the people who donated money based on false pretenses, but also me, since she'd used my identity and reputation without permission. On the other hand, Jessica was still my daughter, and the thought of her facing criminal prosecution was almost unbearable. Despite what she'd done, I couldn't escape the fact that taking action against her would likely result in her going to prison and having a permanent criminal record that would affect the rest of her life. I also had to consider the impact on the people who donated money believing they were helping me fight cancer. These were friends, family members, and community members who'd given generously because they cared about me and wanted to help during what they believed was a medical crisis. They deserved to know the truth about what had happened to their donations, but I also dreaded having to tell them that their kindness had been exploited. The practical implications were also staggering. Jessica had raised over $50,000 through various channels, money that would need to be returned to donors. Even if she was willing to cooperate in returning the funds, there was no guarantee that all the money still existed or that all donors could be identified and contacted. After several sleepless nights of agonizing over what to do, I decided that I had to confront Jessica directly before making any decisions about involving law enforcement or contacting donors. I needed to understand her motivations, hear her explanation, and give her a chance to voluntarily make things right. I also realized that I needed to stop the ongoing fraud immediately. Every day that passed meant potentially more donations from people who believed they were helping me fight cancer. I couldn't allow Jessica's deception to continue while I tried to figure out how to handle the situation. The confrontation with Jessica was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I waited until Robert was at work and we could talk privately, then asked Jessica to sit down with me in the living room for a serious conversation. When I told Jessica that I knew about the GoFundMe page, the Facebook updates, and the donations she'd been collecting, her initial reaction was to deny everything. She claimed that someone must have created fake accounts using her name, or that there had been some kind of misunderstanding about who was organizing the fundraising efforts. But when I showed her printed copies of the posts she'd written, the donation records, and the messages she'd sent to family members, her denials became increasingly desperate and illogical. Finally, when I told her that I'd already spoken with Linda and several other family members who'd confirmed receiving calls from her about my supposed diagnosis, Jessica broke down and admitted to the entire scheme. What Jessica told me during that conversation was even more disturbing than what I'd already discovered. She confessed that she'd been planning the cancer fraud for months before actually launching it, researching medical terminology and treatment protocols to make her story as believable as possible. She'd chosen ovarian cancer specifically because it was a disease that could progress quickly and would explain why I might seem fine to casual observers while actually being seriously ill. She'd calculated that the combination of urgent medical need and potential for tragic outcome would motivate people to donate generously without asking too many questions. Jessica admitted that she'd been monitoring my daily activities and moved to time her fictional updates appropriately, using real photos and genuine details about my life to make her posts more authentic and emotionally compelling. She'd even planned to eventually post about my fictional death from cancer, which would have ended the fundraising but also prevented donors from ever discovering that the entire medical crisis had been fabricated. When I asked her what she'd done with the money she'd raised, Jessica's answer was devastating. She'd used the donations to pay off credit card debt, buy a new car, and fund what she described as investments in cryptocurrency and online trading platforms. Virtually all of the money was gone, spent on personal expenses and speculative investments that had lost value. Most heartbreaking was Jessica's complete lack of remorse for what she'd done. She seemed to view the people who'd donated as gullible marks rather than caring individuals who'd been motivated by genuine concern for my well-being. She expressed frustration that I'd discovered her scheme before she could finish the story and move on to her next plan. When I asked her how she could do something so cruel and manipulative to people who loved and trusted her, Jessica shrugged and said that everyone has money problems and that she was just more creative than most people in finding solutions. She seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset about her actions, as if lying about my having cancer and stealing money from our friends and family was a reasonable response to financial stress. The Jessica sitting across from me during that conversation was a stranger. She bore no resemblance to the daughter I thought I'd raised or the caring young woman who'd organized legitimate charitable events in our community. She was cold, calculating, and completely without empathy for the people she'd hurt. The aftermath of discovering Jessica's fraud was devastating for our entire family. Robert was so shocked and disgusted by what Jessica had done that he initially refused to believe it was possible. When I showed him the evidence and explained the full scope of her deception, he was heartbroken and furious. We immediately contacted a lawyer to understand our legal options and obligations. The lawyer explained that Jessica had committed multiple serious crimes and that we had a legal and ethical obligation to report her actions to law enforcement. He also advised us that we should contact all known donors as quickly as possible to inform them about the fraud and begin the process of attempting to return their money. The most difficult part was making the phone calls and sending the messages to inform people that Jessica's entire cancer story had been fabricated. These conversations were heartbreaking for everyone involved. People who donated money and emotional support based on their care for me were shocked, hurt, and angry to learn that their generosity had been exploited. Many donors were understanding and supportive, recognizing that Robert and I were also victims of Jessica's deception. But others were angry and felt betrayed not just by Jessica but by our entire family. Some people questioned whether we'd known about the scheme all along, and a few accused us of being complicit in the fraud. The impact on our community was also significant. The revelation that Jessica had been lying about my having cancer created suspicion and mistrust that affected other legitimate fundraising efforts in our town. People became more skeptical about donation requests and community support campaigns, worried that they might be victims of similar schemes. Jessica was ultimately charged with fraud, theft, identity theft, and several other crimes related to her fundraising scheme. The evidence against her was overwhelming, including the online posts she'd created, the financial records of donations received, and her own confession to the crimes. She accepted a plea deal that included prison time, probation, and an order to pay full restitution to all donors. However, since she'd spent virtually all of the stolen money and had no legitimate income or assets, the likelihood of donors recovering their losses was minimal. The legal proceedings were emotionally exhausting for Robert and me. We had to testify about Jessica's actions, provide evidence of her crimes, and face the difficult reality that our own daughter was going to prison for what she'd done to us and to people who tried to help. The impact on our family relationships was also devastating. Jessica's actions had damaged our relationships with extended family members and friends who'd been manipulated by her lies. Some people blamed us for raising a daughter capable of such elaborate deception, while others felt uncomfortable around us because we reminded them of how they'd been fooled. Robert and I also struggled with guilt and self-doubt about our parenting and our failure to recognize what Jessica was doing. We questioned whether we'd missed warning signs or whether there were aspects of Jessica's character that we'd failed to address when she was younger. The financial recovery process was complicated and largely unsuccessful. While we made every effort to return donations to people who'd been deceived, the reality was that most of the money was simply gone. Jessica had spent it on personal expenses and failed investments, leaving nothing to recover. Some donors were understanding about the financial loss, recognizing that we'd also been victimized by Jessica's scheme. But others demanded full restitution and threatened legal action when we couldn't provide it. The financial stress of trying to compensate victims of Jessica's fraud added another layer of difficulty to an already devastating situation. The emotional recovery process was even more challenging than the financial and legal aspects. Learning that my own daughter had been using my identity to perpetrate fraud while watching me live my normal life was a trauma that required professional help to process. I went through months of therapy to deal with the betrayal, the violation of my identity and relationships, and the guilt I felt about the people who'd been hurt by Jessica's actions. My therapist helped me understand that Jessica's behavior was not a reflection of my failures as a mother, but rather the result of character defects and psychological issues that I couldn't have prevented or predicted. The impact on my marriage was also significant. Robert and I had to work through our different ways of processing Jessica's betrayal and our disagreements about how to handle the aftermath. The stress of the legal proceedings, the financial implications, and the damage to our community relationships put a strain on our relationship that required couples counseling to address. Perhaps most difficult was learning to trust again and rebuild relationships that had been damaged by Jessica's lies. Many people in our community had been affected by her deception, either as donors who'd lost money or as friends who'd been emotionally manipulated by her fictional updates about my health. Rebuilding those relationships required difficult conversations about what had happened, acknowledgments of the pain that had been caused, and patience as people processed their own feelings about being deceived. Some relationships were permanently damaged, while others eventually healed but were never quite the same. I also had to deal with the ongoing impact of having my identity and medical information used without permission. Jessica's fake updates about my health had created a permanent digital record of fictional medical information that could potentially affect my reputation and relationships for years to come. The GoFundMe page and Facebook posts had been viewed and shared by hundreds of people, creating a widespread false narrative about my health that was difficult to completely correct. Even after we'd contacted known donors and explained the truth, there were undoubtedly people who'd seen Jessica's posts but whom we couldn't identify or contact directly. Today, more than 3 years after discovering Jessica's medical fraud, I'm still dealing with the aftermath of her actions. She completed her prison sentence last year, but she hasn't attempted to contact Robert or me since her release. We've made the difficult decision that we don't want any relationship with her unless she demonstrates genuine remorse and makes meaningful efforts to repair the damage she caused. The financial impact of Jessica's fraud was ultimately manageable for us, though it required significant lifestyle adjustments and delayed some of our retirement plans. The greater damage was to our faith in people and our sense of security in our community relationships. However, the experience also taught me valuable lessons about the importance of verifying information independently, maintaining healthy boundaries in family relationships, and recognizing that love doesn't require accepting abusive or criminal behavior from family members. I've also become involved in educating others about medical fraud and identity theft, particularly schemes that target family members and close-knit communities. Jessica's case was unfortunately not unique. There are many instances of people creating fake medical crises to solicit donations from caring friends and family members. The warning signs to watch for include requests for money that come with emotional manipulation, reluctance to provide detailed medical information or allow direct contact with healthcare providers, inconsistencies between claimed medical conditions and observed symptoms, and fundraising efforts that seem disproportionate to the supposed medical need. Most importantly, I learned that genuine medical crises don't require secrecy or dramatic fundraising campaigns. Legitimate healthcare costs can be verified through direct contact with medical providers. Insurance companies provide clear documentation of coverage and costs, and real patients are usually willing to provide detailed information about their conditions and treatments. While I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone, I'm grateful for the strength and wisdom it ultimately brought me. I now have much more realistic expectations about family relationships, better boundaries with people who ask for financial help, and greater appreciation for the genuine friends and community members who supported us through this difficult time. The experience also reinforced my belief in the importance of honesty, integrity, and taking responsibility for our actions. Jessica's fraud caused tremendous pain and financial loss for many people, but her refusal to show genuine remorse or make meaningful amends has made healing much more difficult for everyone involved. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more true stories about family betrayal and fraud, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts about Jessica's medical fraud in the comments below and let us know if you've experienced similar deceptions by family members. For another shocking story about family manipulation, check out the video suggestion that should be appearing on your screen right now.